So, are you ready for session one? Yes. Ah, so much better. I think it was her stories that did it. So, up first, our very first session of our very first day of the 5th edition is Inglorious Empire, the reality of the British Raj. And for this, I would like to welcome on stage Dr. Shashi Tharoor and Sanjeev Sanyal. Author, politician, and former international civil servant. Of course, he needs no introduction. Dr. Shashi Tharoor wrote The Era of Darkness, the British Empire in India, a second-term Lok Sabha MP and chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. He's also served as Minister of State for HRD and Minister of State for External Affairs. Dr. Tharoor is the award-winning author of 16 books, so a very warm welcome to him for our very first session of the day. Joining him on stage is economist and author Sanjeev Sanyal, and he was named the Young Global Leader 2010 by the World Economic Forum and was Deutsche Bank's global strategist and a managing director until last year. A well-known environmentalist and urban theorist, his books include Land of the Seven Rivers, The Indian Renaissance, and The Ocean of Churn. So once again, a very big round of applause and welcome both of these eminent people on stage to start off our very first session.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be here back in Bangalore. So a big thank you to the organizers for putting it all together. It's also a particular pleasure to have this opportunity to do this conversation with Shashi, who is a dear friend as well. His latest book, which I hope we will discuss in some length today, is just out, I think, a few weeks back. And it's actually a rewriting of the history of the British colonial period from an Indian perspective. And I think that's a particularly interesting thing that we should be doing. This is the seventh, we are soon going to be an independent country for 70 years. But one of the things that is quite amazing about this story of the colonial period is that even though we have been independent for some 70 odd years, we have to a very large extent continued to perpetuate the mythology that the colonials had imposed on us about their rule in India. And that's quite amazing because we have imbibed it to such an extent that we are entirely, in some cases, unconscious of how we perpetuate some of these myths. We do, for example, we read books like the Tarzan comics or Phantom, not realizing that underlying it is really a story of paternal, European, paternalistic, sort of looking after the natives, and that really the natives should be grateful for the fact that they are being ruled by these white-skinned people. And this is sort of there in many, many little ways in the story. So even educated Indians will very often, say, the English gave us so many things, they gave us cricket and English and laws and so on, as if on balance it was a good thing. And so I think this is a story that needs to be retold from our perspective. As the African proverb goes, as long as the lions do not have their storytellers, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. So with that, let me turn over to Shashi and ask him, well, why did you write this book, and why, after 70 odd years of being independent, we still need to tell this story?
Thank you, Sanjeev, for making me a lion for the occasion. I'm deeply grateful. And really great to see so many of you here this morning, braving Bangalore traffic to get here. It's wonderful to see you all. Now, this book somewhat unusually began as a speech, and some of you are probably aware of this. I happened to deliver a speech at the Oxford Union in a debate on the British colonies, British owing reparations to their former colonies. it was posted on YouTube a month or so later, and to my astonishment, went viral to an unbelievable extent, with literally millions of downloads and all sorts of interesting activities, which I won't, out of uncharacteristic modesty, I shall refrain from going into details, except to say that one of the consequences was my publishers calling me and saying, "You've got to make this into a book." To which my reaction was, "Why bother? Everyone knows this already." And my publisher, David Davidar, said, "No, they don't, because if they did, your speech wouldn't have gone viral." Which kind of, I suppose, made sense. And I said, all right, well, if this really needs to be retold, I'll tell it, not realizing, of course, that I'd bitten off quite a bit more than I thought I had, because it was necessary. You know, when you're making a 15-minute speech, your preparation is at one level. When you're making writing a 330-page book, it needs a lot more substantiation. And so that enabled me to embark on a journey which involved a lot of research and reading, of a kind that I hadn't done since my doctorate. And it was a lot of fun in many ways, because life has become so much easier in the 4 decades since I did my doctorate, because now you can get a vast array of material without having to go to a dozen libraries to dig it up, thanks to the modern conveniences of digital libraries and documents on Google Search and Google Scholar, and of course the various academic journals in modern history are also available in various repositories. So with the help of some diligent researchers, I was able to assemble a vast trove of material onto a Google Drive, and then without having to carry the equivalent of a couple of libraries worth of books, I was able to plow through a lot of material that confirmed my prejudices, shall I say, but in some ways added to and deepened my appreciation of all of these things. So I would argue to some degree that the reaction of people confirms my feeling that many in India perhaps either haven't been taught history well or have not deeply imbibed what they've taught. Because a lot of what I'm saying ought to be known to most educated Indians. And I don't imagine that 100% of it will be known to anybody, because I really did some very eclectic and wide-ranging research. But I would say that most people who have studied contemporary or modern India, that is India of the last 200 or 300 years, should have known 80 to 90% of this. But oddly enough, most people say they didn't. And therefore, it seems the book has contributed to a certain eye-opening. Now, on the second point as to why after 70 years we need to do this, it's a fair question. And particularly, some young people have said to me, well, it's been so long, isn't it time we move on? And I say, of course we should move on. In fact, in my book, on multiple places, I say that this is not to either excuse or justify anything in the present. But I do believe we need to know history for itself. We need to confront the past on its own terms, because if you don't know where you've come from, how will you appreciate where you're going? Just as every human being here wants to know a little bit about their father and mother and grandparents and have some sense of their past origins before they were born, as it were, we as a society, as a civilization, as a country, I believe, need to be aware of where we've come from. And that, to my mind, is why the book needed to be written.
I mean, I think this is this is a very important thing that you just said. It's quite astonishing, as I was mentioning, the extent to which we consciously or unconsciously perpetuate colonial era myths ourselves. Now, if you go to other countries, like say Indonesia, now Indonesia was actually ruled by the Dutch a lot longer than India was ruled by the British. And yet, they have basically told their own story. They've ripped out the colonial construct of their history very, very substantially. Whereas in India, we tend to, in fact, almost welcome Western perspectives of our history as if it is, in fact, has a higher value in some way. So somebody like Charles Allen, who, patronizingly almost justifies, in a soft sort of way, but he justifies British rule in some of his writings. In any other country would be called a racist, but in fact, you'll find his books lined up in Indian bookshops and being read as, as if there is not a problem by Indians.
Well, we are a forgiving people, you know. It's very interesting. There is an anecdote I mention in the book that apparently Nehru, a few years after independence, was received by that absolutely unpleasant scoundrel Winston Churchill, who apparently, and this is possibly an apocryphal story, but I heard it from a reliable source, who apparently said to Nehru, "How is it that you have no bitterness and rancor towards us? After all, we made you spend more than 10 years of your life in jails." To which Nehru apparently replied, "I was taught by a great man, obviously Mahatma Gandhi, never to fear and never to hate," which in many ways I think is a wonderful sort of subtext for the attitude of the Indian nationalists. One could argue it went beyond that, because some of the decisions made by the triumphant nationalist leaders who brought India to independence, decisions, for example, to keep India in the Commonwealth, to retain what was the Imperial Civil Service as the new IAS, and continue with the steel frame of the Raj, to keep the Indian Army exactly the way it was, but not allow back into it those nationalists who had rebelled under the INA. But all of these things suggest that it was not just forgiveness, but that a lot of us, a lot of our sort of forebears had internalized the sort of the British myth, as it were, by the 1940s. In fact, it's striking because Indians too, rather like the American revolutionaries of 1776, were fighting for the rights of Englishmen. These were rights that the English were enjoying and denying to Indians, and therefore the progressive claiming of those rights to do what the English were doing was, I think, at least at the subconscious level, part of the nationalist struggle. And therefore, when we transformed ourselves from a colony into an independent nation, there was much more continuity than change, very much more. In everything, right down to the adoption of the parliamentary system, which, as I argue, was probably grossly unsuited to the realities of the Indian temperament. And I've argued this for 25 years, I'm not saying anything new, that nonetheless, because the British had it, it must be the desirable thing to have. They didn't give it to us, therefore we must have it.
So the question to ask then, were the British especially bad, in the sense that were they, it could be argued, and the British very often do, they were certainly better than, well, the Spanish behaved in Latin America, or the Portuguese behaved in India. The Goa Inquisition is one of the shocking episodes in Indian history, and again, one of those episodes not taught in our history books for some reason. But so can the British at least claim that, yeah, we colonized, we were bad, but we were not as bad as those guys?
Well, that is one of the arguments that's being made for them. But, nobody was entirely good or entirely bad. They all had their pluses and their minuses. In the case of the Portuguese, for example, the period of the Inquisition, which lasted less than a century, was particularly grotesque. And they not only tortured, prosecuted, killed, converted large numbers of Hindus, they also ended India's proud record of having been the only country in the world which had hosted a Jewish diaspora for over 1,500 years that had never known a single episode of anti-Semitism. Because when the Portuguese showed up and they found Jews in northern Kerala, they started persecuting them.
They also did that to the Syrian Christians, by the way.
Exactly. So that was part of the religious zealotry the Portuguese had, and the British never had. It took 150 years of British presence in India before the first bishop showed up. They were not particularly worried about proselytizing. They were in it for the money, very bluntly. But Napoleon called them, with good reason, a nation of shopkeepers. And the money was always the principal motive in British colonialism, as I demonstrate in some detail in the book. But, for example, the Portuguese were not half as racist as the English. So a lot of assimilation took place. The existence of significant mestizo communities, which has now resulted in a Portuguese prime minister being elected this year, who is half Goan. So that is to the credit of the Portuguese. Or take the French. The Belgians were appalling in the Congo, but the French, in many cases, imparted a narrative of assimilation, which had little Vietnamese and Senegalese kids dutifully reciting "Nos ancêtres les Gaulois," our ancestors, the Gauls. And a black African in the 1930s could proudly say, "Moi je suis français, I am French," in a way that no Indian before 47 could ever say, "I am British," because he was not allowed to. Even Niraj Chaudhury's cringe-making autobiography, and even more cringe-making dedication to his autobiography, describes the British Empire as having denied citizenship but conferred subjecthood. And if even a man like that, with his nose stuck firmly up the colonial fundament, could acknowledge this, then that you can see how deeply different the British were. So it all depends on what mattered more to you. If racism was an issue, well, the British were right up there with the worst. If sort of massacres per head of population accounted, then despite Jallianwala Bagh and despite 1857, 58 and so on, the British are lower down the totem pole than, say, the Belgians or the Spanish. And so it goes. There are, but
how you measure the damage.
How do you measure evil? I mean, there's something fundamentally wrong with what was done, and then relative comparisons of wrongdoing, I don't think a particularly edifying thing for us to do.
So one of the things that I think you've attempted to do is to try and show how the British way of thinking about things ended up affecting the way we think about our own culture. And one of the things you, I think, bring up is about caste. That, of course, caste is a very old institution, but the way, the sort of rigid way in which it came to be is largely a British construct. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, that was something that I must admit even opened up my eyes a little bit. We all know about divide and rule, and we all know about how very consciously, deliberately, the British fomented Hindu-Muslim divisions. What I was not prepared for was the extent to which the caste system as we know it today, and has been deeply internalized and effectively practiced by all our political parties and everything else, was essentially a legacy of the British Raj. You see, we had castes and subcastes, we had social discrimination, particularly against Dalits. All that is true. But we didn't have a caste system in the way that the British conferred it to us. We had a lot of fluidity. The Chaturvarna concept that the British insisted was the norm was not the norm in most parts of the country. Essentially, it started as late as the late 18th century when the British decided that to be an effective colonial power, you needed to classify, categorize, and understand the people you were ruling in order to control them better. So when the British decided to try and understand what Hinduism was all about, they assembled a dozen Brahmins in Calcutta and told them to tell the British what Hinduism was and how it worked. And naturally, the Brahmins wrote an incredibly self-serving document in which they vindicated their own superiority. It was called the Code of Gentoo Laws. It was issued under Warren Hastings. Only one Brit was smart enough to realize they were being had, and that was Sir William Jones, the wonderful Orientalist, before Orientalism was a bad word, who founded the Asiatic Society. And he said these Brahmins are basically making up the Hindu faith to suit their own interests. And if it's not available in the scriptures, they will invent it for you for ready money. We shouldn't trust these guys. But in fact, the British did. And so to begin with, you had, I mean, for example, it was a preposterous notion that the Brahmins propagated that they were actually the ones who were on top of the heap and that they gave instructions to all the kings. Nonsense. History is replete with kings and warriors and kshatriyas hiring, firing, seeking advice from, rejecting advice off, whatever. Their Brahmin counselors as
not just Kshatriya kings, there were Dalit kings, I mean,
kings of any totally, of all backgrounds. The other thing is that caste is actually much more fluid. I mean, M.N. Srinivas in his famous theory of Sanskritization has described how entire subcastes could move up the totem pole. They were not locked in place into this Chaturvarna orbit. In North India, for example, the Kayasth community started off as Shudras, but because they learned Persian and became scribes in the Persian court and in all the government institutions in the Mughal court, and in all the government institutions. Like that, they rose up. And they rose up and became an incredibly influential community right into British, because then they switched from Persian to English and became ICS officers. So, you actually had that. Or you have groups of various different origins that, for example, a Shudra in one part of India could literally get up and move to another part of India, take another profession and reinvent his caste. It was only the British who locked us into these immutable, impermeable identities. And in so doing, of course, stratified not only Indian society from their point of view as rulers, but also affected the self-definition of Indians, who began to identify more and more exclusively with these notions of caste. What is even more striking, for example, is how the Shia-Sunni problems in Lucknow were a legacy of British colonialism. Right up to the mid-19th century, right up to Wajid Ali Shah as the Nawab Awad, the Muharram commemoration every year and the procession was a joint effort of Shia, Sunnis and Hindus. It was only when the British came and started writing up all these classifications and said, no, 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 in these places a purely Shia thing, only Shias will run it, only Shias are in charge, that then the Shias and the Sunnis started having problems. In a few years of the British taking over, the Shias and Sunnis were abusing each other and Shia-Sunni violence started after that. It's quite startling the extent to which right down the chain these things happened, and of course religion was the most egregious example of it.
So now we have talked a lot about how the British were bad about and told us all kinds of wrong history, but of course they are not entirely to be blamed. We have ourselves done a lot of this, in fact, even after independence. Since we are in the bit right now discussing about rethinking narratives, one of the big narratives that is, in my view at least, extremely problematic is our own narrative of the independence movement, which after independence, because the Congress party was in power, has been entirely told from the perspective of the Congress, leaving out many other strains of the independence movement, particularly the revolutionaries, who played an extremely important role, and many of their narratives have simply been wiped out. So we hear very little in our textbooks about the Ghadar movement, or the Hindustan Republican Army, or about the naval mutiny of 1946, about the fact that the mutineers, both from the INA and the naval mutiny, were never taken back into the armed forces, and of course, very important characters like Raj Bihari Bose were simply wiped out of the narrative. Now, I'm very sensitive about this, I'll tell you why, because my family has a history on both sides of this narrative. My great-grandfather was the chief whip of the Congress party in the Bengal Legislative Assembly, which was, of course, the largest, most populous province in British India. So he was a very senior person in the Congress. But my father's family were revolutionaries and were very heavily involved in all these Ghadar movement, Kakori case, and so on. Several of them went to jail, to Kalapani, were hanged, and so on. So I've heard this story from both sides, and I have a sympathy to the view that after independence, the story of the revolutionaries was systematically edited out of the narrative. And I think that too needs to be rewritten.
Yes and no. I tend to be a little wary of conspiracy theories because I know our country, it's impossible to organize a conspiracy. we are far too chaotic, disorganized, and diverse to do that. There is a problem with the way history is taught in the sense that the approved textbooks, but of course there are multiple streams, so you can do if you were to talk about the way history is taught, you would have to take a textbook from the ICSE, from the CBSE, from the Higher Secondary Board, then from the language of your state. Then you'll have to take the equivalents in a different state, say in South India. I mean, growing up in North India, as I did, I went, all my schooling was in Bombay, Calcutta, and Delhi. I hardly learned anything.
Calcutta is not in North India.
Look, just as for North Indians, anything south of the Vindhyas is Madrasi. For me, anything north of the Vindhyas is North India.
As a Bengali, let me clarify. Everything west of Jharkhand is West India.
So the capital of India is in West India now. Good. The West Indies, newly invented. Now, what I wanted to say was that growing up and studying history, which was my passion in the north, I learned practically nothing about the southern empires. I didn't know about the Cheras, the Pandyas, the Pallavas, the Vijayanagar Empire, because even in those textbooks where there were sections or chapters or paragraphs on those were skipped and the focus was entirely a northern-centric view. So we know far more about a relatively minor dynasty like the Lodhis than we do about Vijayanagar, which is one of the great empires of its time. I know you are doing very good work, Sanjeev, in correcting these perspectives in your own writing. But I'm just saying that in the ways in which, I'm sorry, this must be difficult for all of you, I'll pause.
This is an attempt to silence us.
He is a believer in conspiracy theories.
This is a flight from British Airways.
Wonderful. Okay, so coming back to historical, so just as in many ways the South has been written out of Northern perspectives, and in a similar way other things are written out, it's simply that in knowing what to teach, I think by and large our school syllabus writers have taken the easy way out. There is a lovely little narrative that involves, of course, Mahatma Gandhi and non-violence and ahimsa and satyagraha and all that, and there is another narrative of religious division, partition, and so on, and beyond that there is not much else. I think that there are two important continuing debates, though, about the partition narrative. I don't believe the use of violence has been totally neglected, and that the material is there if you want to know it. And so, for example, the incredible popularity of Bhagat Singh, who after all was executed at the age of 21, very bright, brilliant young man, and arguably wasted life in the sense that to be hanged for a futile act of terrorism when he had so much to contribute intellectually and otherwise, shows what a tremendous loss his passing was for India. But still, in the history of India, his contribution to India's independence was, let's face it, essentially modest and marginal. But the extraordinary heroic stature he enjoys is a reflection of the fact that the contributions of those who were violent have not been totally elided. They're there. You just have to, if you have affinity for those things, whether it's Bhagat Singh, whether it's the various conspiracy cases, whether it's the earlier Aurobindo, who, as you know, fled to Pondicherry after being wanted for bomb throwing and exhortation to violence against the British. All of these things have been an important strain of the movement, and Sanjeev is right that one thing that's totally underestimated is both the Indian National Army's definitely unsuccessful revolt and the equally unsuccessful revolt by not one but several shiploads of Indian sailors in Bombay Harbour in 1946, which actually was the only time in the war that we actually fired shells upon the sort of Indian peninsula, because they did fire shells and set alight a few installations in Bombay port. Now, at a time when Britain was exhausted from the Second World War, I have no doubt that they would have felt that once the fires of rebellion had been ignited, that the price it would cost to continue suppressing such rebellions would be more than an exhausted, bankrupted, broke, rationing-laden British society and economy would be prepared to bear. And therefore, I think the role of that violence, those violent incidents in British thinking has to be acknowledged and incorporated into the narrative. The second other thing that I think is important for us to acknowledge is contested territory today. In my book, when I speak about 200 years of foreign rule, I am saying something which cuts across the political narrative divide in India, because people of the right, the left, the Marxists, the BJP, and the Congress can all agree, broadly speaking, on my diagnosis. But there are those who would go further. And as you know, many in the present ruling circles of our country do not speak of 200 years of foreign rule, they speak of 1,200 years of foreign rule.
800.
Well, I've heard Narendra Modi say 1,200, that's why I mentioned that number. But 800
It includes Sindh, yes.
Yeah, well, he's going, I think, before even Mahmud of Ghazni.
Yes, it would have to include Sindh.
Yeah, well, he's starting off with Sindh, exactly. 712. Now, what's interesting is that, to my mind, those who came to India from elsewhere but stayed here and assimilated here ceased to be foreign rulers in my analysis. Even if you can accuse them of looting India, they spent their loot in India. They kept their loot in India. They didn't have a continuing foreign allegiance. And of course, they merged their blood and their genes with India so that by the time of the fourth Mughal, there was hardly any Fergana Valley blood left. Every one of the maternal line had been Indian, from starting off with Akbar's mother, then Akbar's wife, then Jahangir's wife, etc. All of them were entirely born here. So that the allegiance to India, yes, it's true that you would have Mughal emperors occasionally receiving envoys from Central Asia and asking with curiosity about their ancestors' tombs in the Fergana Valley, and sometimes even giving a small contribution for the upkeep of those tombs and so on. But that was it. Very unlike what the British did, which was to rule India for the profit and benefit of Britain. London and Dundee and Edinburgh and so on were built on money drained and looted and expropriated from India. And that's something, and not just India, the other colonies, the Caribbean colonies as well, the sugar. And what we forget is even the British elite here. I mean, it was astonishing. You read, for example, I've got a section on the Imperial Civil Service and so on. They were the highest paid civil service on the world, far more highly paid than if they'd served in Britain or in America. They essentially, for 20 years of service, which included 4 years of paid leave in England, they not only got these high salaries all paid for by Indian taxes, but then a lifetime pension back in England after that. They not only lived these sort of lives of great comfort, but when they earned their salaries, they repatriated most of those salaries abroad because they lived, only a small fraction of their salaries needed to be spent in India to live comfortably. Even simple things like some of the arts and crafts of India, which say the Mughal nobles had patronized, became unviable because the British were not interested in these objects. They were more interested in things they could buy in London and Paris. It's a small trivial example, but it shows you the extent to which their allegiance, their interests were there and not here. That, to my mind, is a definition of foreign rule, and therefore, to my mind, the Mughal rulers and all the other Muslim kings and emperors in India over those previous centuries are not foreign rulers. So to my mind, those who speak in terms of that side of the narrative are really making a political point about Indian Muslims in India today that I don't subscribe to. So there is still contested territory.
Let me say that let me respectfully disagree with that.
I expected you to. We have to give them some fireworks.
Because the fact of the matter is that the elites, the Turkic elite and the Persianized elite did invade India. And by the way, they did live lives which were very, very separate from those who ruled. I mean, the Tughlaqs, the Khiljis, and so on. There is more than adequate evidence in Farishta and other places where clearly the elite was entirely foreign-born. And in fact, even the Indian-born children of many of those were not given high posts. That only the imported from Uzbek or Persian elite was given top roles. But anyway, we will leave that and move on to the next discussion.
Okay,
which
just on the record to say that if you're looking at an entire period of several centuries, such examples as you give would have accounted for less than 10% of those years. I can give
That's
you many,
not true, but anyway.
I can give you many counter examples, Sanjeev, because even a man who in this state has become an object of political controversy, Tipu Sultan, it is important to realize that every one of his sort of courtiers, his cabinet ministers, as it were Hindus. That he gave an enormous amount of money for the upkeep of and establishment of Hindu temples. So the story is always far more complex than the kinds of
So the moment I bring up something, so, oh, it's very complex. That's no argument.
No, it is an argument.
No.
Aurangzeb had Rajput generals. Shivaji had Muslim generals.
Oh, by the way, so did the British have Indian soldiers, but that you are now categorizing it as colonial rule. So what? But anyway.
So what? So what? The difference is those Indians belonged here and the Brits didn't. Here, all these people did belong here, settled here,
They
remained
didn't.
here.
The subsequent generations, they assimilated, it's true. But when
Did
they
the
did,
Brits?
yeah, but Bakhtiyar Khilji would be entirely surprised to hear of himself being called as Indian. But anyway.
Yeah, but by the time you got to the next Khilji,
No, there were several Khiljis. They were ultimately wiped out by another bunch of Central Asians. They didn't assimilate. But anyway, that's a different issue.
no, actually
But
they did. But I mean, this is a quarrel where
we
have
can,
to
we
get
can
into
go on for a long time.
points that are not in my book. So let's move on to
Yeah.
the last 200
So I
years.
think before I open it out to Q&A, let me say that you do make a point about reparations and an apology. Now, I, by the way, agree with that, but let me play the devil's advocate here. Why should the British alone make these apologies? I mean, after all, why not the Portuguese? Why shouldn't the Roman Italians be making apology to the British for invading them in the 1st century BC? So why pick on the British specifically?
First of all, because it's more recent than the Romans. I mean, after all, the Romans should be apologizing to the Christians for feeding them to the lions, right? I mean, if you keep going further back, it gets absurd. So at some point, I mean, there are still 6 million Indians alive today who were alive during the British Raj. So it's just about time. But also because our sensibilities have evolved to a point where there's much more consciousness. I certainly would be in favor of a Portuguese apology in Goa. And I would very much, I mean, let me just clarify, because Sanjeev did mention reparations. I'm actually not calling for reparations. I got into that debate at Oxford because that was a topic the Oxford Union gave us. But I even there just asked for a symbolic £1 a year for 200 years, which frankly no finance minister would want to administer. It would be a nightmare. So let's assume that that's not going to be paid. But the larger problem is that any sum that is payable in reparations would not be credible in terms of what they actually took from here. And any sum that would be credible would not be payable because it would be too vast. An Indian journalist of Sanjeev's political leanings has actually computed, after my Oxford debate, what he thinks it would cost for fair reparations from Britain, and he came up with a figure so astronomical, £3 trillion sterling, that it would actually exceed the entire British GDP. So no one's going to pay it. Let's put that aside. But I said instead of reparations, there can be atonement. And atonement, I have suggested, can take two forms. The first, and I think the most important, is an apology. And I have given two examples. There are many more, by the way. There are two examples worth citing in this context. One is Willy Brandt, the Social Democrat Chancellor of Germany, going to Poland in 1970 and sinking to his knees in the Warsaw Ghetto to beg forgiveness from the Polish people, and particularly Polish Jews, for what the Nazis had done. Now, Willy Brandt is a social democrat who was completely free of the taint of what the Nazis had done. In fact, he and social democrats like him were persecuted by the Nazis, interned, killed, and so on. But as the head of the German government, he felt it was his duty to express that regret, that remorse on the part of the German people to the Polish people. The second example is far more recent. It's from this year, when Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, apologized in the Canadian Parliament to the people of India for the Komagata Maru incident 100 years ago, when this Japanese ship full of Indian immigrants, many Sikhs mainly, but not only, was turned away from the port of Vancouver, and pretty much everybody on that ship met a grisly death at the hands of the British later. Now, the Canadians didn't actually kill these people, they just turned them away. But the turning away has led to this apology. Now, it seems to me, and I've suggested this, that on the centenary of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, the single worst atrocity that was emblematic of everything that was wrong about British rule, the unprovoked firing on unarmed protesters, the merciless killing of men, women, children, the grisly treatment thereafter of the people. For 24 hours, no one was allowed to even pick up the bodies or help the wounded. Indians were then forced to crawl on their bellies on the neighboring street. I mean, everything about it was awful. And then after all that, the British raised a subscription to reward Dyer for having massacred Indians. And Rudyard Kipling called him the man who saved India. He was hailed as the savior of India. This was the awfulness that epitomized everything that was wrong about British colonialism in one incident. So if on that occasion, that centenary, a representative of Britain, either a member of the royal family or the Prime Minister of the day, could come, ideally fall on his or her knees at Jallianwala Bagh and beg forgiveness, it seems to me it would cleanse much of the sin, which obviously none of us alive today have had to live through, but which is such a seminal incident in the shaping of Indian national consciousness. And the second point I make is the other way of atonement is to teach colonial history in their schools, which they do not do. I've cited a Gallup poll in which some astonishing percentage, I think 39% or more, have said they would love to have a British Empire still today in Britain. I mean, that's the kind of thinking going on. The week this book came out in India, a Pakistani journalist published an article in The Guardian reflecting on how she'd brought up 2 children in one of the best private schools, public school as the British call it, in London, Westminster. And they had majored in history, but they'd never studied a word of colonial history. There is this convenient historical amnesia in Britain which permits the kind of self-justificatory apologias being published by the likes of Neil Ferguson and Charles Allen Martin and Lawrence James and all of these people, and the TV serials in which rose-tinted lenses are applied to depict the glories of the British Raj, completely forgetting the actual sordid reality of the horrors inflicted upon India. And so, unless this corrective perspective is there, again, thinking back on Germany, you know, Germans of my generation and just older were not told anything by their parents, because the parents had been in the war, had fought in the war, had been perhaps Nazi youth, whatever. They didn't say a word to their children. You talk to Germans today in their 60s, you will not find one who heard a word about the World War II from his parents. And then you see what happened around about 1980. It changed completely. Every class of German school children now bus to the concentration camps to see what was done in the name of their country and why it should never be allowed to happen again. Now, that kind of conscious fighting back against forgetting. You know, the history of humanity often involves not only remembering history, as Sanjeev and I tried to do, but also knowing what to forget. And choosing what not to forget is a very important part of how you shape yourselves as a nation.
Fabulous. I think, do we have time for a few questions from the audience?
Are there handheld mics or anything? There's a hand going right up there.
There's several hands.
You play traffic cop, right?
Yes, I can contribute. Is there somebody from the organizers who can hand out the mic? Okay, we'll start with somebody right in front.
Can you elaborate a little by the figures of that exploitation by the British?
Well, the figures are, as I said, contested territory because it depends on what you count. If you're just counting the actual money shipped to England, in the 19th century alone, in a calculation by an English writer called William Digby, who wrote a 902-page book, all of which I have on my laptop drive, he came up with a figure so precise, just on the basis of the East India Company's accounts and the British government annual accounts of 4 billion pounds in those days' money, which is more like about 400 billion pounds today. But that's only the actual money shipped. You're not computing the value of goods in kind. You're not computing the value of the lives lost, for example. How do you compute the value of the 35 million Indians who died totally unnecessarily in famines where it was the British policy not to help? The British had a systematic policy in the 19th century that you must not help in famines for 3 reasons. Number one, you have to absolutely uphold the principles of the free market, and therefore you don't interfere in market forces. People can't afford to buy food, tough. Second, Malthusian population principles. If the land cannot sustain the population that lives on it, people must die. That's how the natural population balance is reasserted. Third principle, very Victorian principle, fiscal prudence. Never spend money you haven't budgeted for. So literally they refused to help even while people were dying in front of their eyes in famines. Not only did they refuse to help, they actually punished anybody who tried to help. Yeah. It was actually a violation of law to help a person dying of famine, whereas, of course, Indian culture in the past had been exactly the opposite, where people immediately reached out to help, Maharajas wouldn't charge taxes if a region was suffering a drought and so on. What we had with the British was the opposite. The taxation was still levied, and what is worse, grain from famine-struck areas used to be shipped off back to London to keep prices manageable there. It was the most outrageous thing, and people died in vast numbers. About 35 million is a conservative estimate. I've given the numbers in my book. How do you put a value on those lives? It's very, very difficult to actually compute specifically what the drain of resources was. But I can point out to one telling statistic. When the British came to India, our country produced 23% of global GDP. We're one of the richest countries in the world. The British left us one of the poorest countries in the world with less than 3% of global GDP, with 90% of our population below the poverty line, whereas poverty, particularly rural poverty, was essentially unknown in India before the British came. You have a country in which the British GDP was so low that statistics for the 17th century compute Britain, France, and Germany together as accounting for less than 3% of global GDP. By 1947, Britain was 10% of global GDP. Of course, the figures are coming down now. As I've often said to people, you don't need to revenge yourself upon history. History is its own revenge. You know,
Yeah, and by the way, the very last episode in that happened in living history, in 1943, the Bengal famine, where 3 million people died. And it happened, it was deliberate, because
one of the most evil men of the 20th century, Winston Churchill. I mean, what he did, he deliberately decided to ship grain from Bengal and from India to Europe to increase the buffer and reserve stocks for a future invasion that hadn't yet happened of Greece. That was, and he said, oh, the death of anyway underfed Bengalis is much less important than that of sturdy Tommies in Europe. When ships laden with grain were sailing past from Australia, sailing past Calcutta port and stopping there for rest and refueling, Churchill refused to let them unload their wheat while people were dying on the streets of Calcutta. He said, no, those grains will continue to Europe. When even conscience-stricken British officials wrote to London pointing out the horrendous cost in human lives and that his decisions were making on him, Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain, just wrote in the margin of the file, why hasn't Gandhi died yet? This is the man who is being hailed by the Brits as an apostle of freedom and democracy. It's contemptible.
So I agree. And you have to remember that there are still people alive who witnessed all of this. So this is not something that happened out there somewhere in the 19th century. There are people alive who witnessed the 1943 famine, and it was horrible. And of course, there is also the huge use of Indian troops in maintaining the British Empire, which, by the way, was paid for by Indian revenues. So the British Empire, it's not only the money shipped back to Britain, but the empire was actually largely built and paid for by us.
Including the First World War. We were the largest single financiers of the First World War. Equivalent of 800 billion pounds was spent on the First World War.
But since you pointed out the percentage of GDP falling from the 20s till about little less than 4% in 1947, let me point out also that from 1947 to 1991, it fell further to 2% under the rule of your party.
I have said in the book that I'm not justifying or excusing anything in the present from the past, but I do believe we need to know the past on its own terms. We can debate other stuff later, but unfortunately on this, as anyone who's read my book, India from Midnight to the Millennium, will tell you, I don't disagree with some of the critiques of our economic policies in that period.
Okay, I'll have to spread it around a little bit, if you don't mind. There's a gentleman there who wants to, can you take the mic? Otherwise, it'll all come from one place and it's not fair. Yeah, just give it to him and then somebody at the back.
Thank you so much.
By the way, how much time do we have?
Ask me.
We'll keep going till we are
I
asked
can
to
tell
stop.
you have 9 more minutes.
Okay, good.
I'll take 30 seconds.
Okay.
I think I gathered right from the first 5 minutes of the talk that we were having today, and that you were having today, that we need to revise, if not rewrite, our history textbooks, especially state board, central board, all of that. But the problem is, if I disagree with somebody, I easily dismiss him or her as, having a political leaning which is something which is biased. So my question to you, Mr. Tharoor, being a member of Congress Party, would you openly support, if not participate, in any such initiative if launched by the current ruling regime to revise our
You
textbooks?
see, it depends on what it involves. I have on record stated, for example, that part of the challenge of colonial rule was that it also colonized our minds. The education system served that purpose. And I have deplored, for example, that we don't teach the Mahabharata and the Ramayana in our schools, just as in Western societies they teach the Iliad and the Odyssey. Why should we not teach our ancient epics? Why is it that we grow up only knowing Shakespeare and knowing nothing of Kalidas? I mean, Kalidas, the small fragments of his work that have survived, probably only 5% of what he ever wrote, even in English translations, are so magnificent, are so brilliantly written with such exquisite poetic metaphors, with so much rich awareness of the human psyche and so on, that you think, my God, if only we had the other 95% of what he wrote, he might be greater than Shakespeare. If somewhere, somehow, a treasure trove of Kalidas manuscripts were found, we would revolutionize global literature. And yet Indian school children don't know anything about Kalidas, pretty much. So these are things that it seems to me I would be willing to support any government doing. Similarly, reference to ancient Indian history. Ancient Indian science is deeply underappreciated. The problem lies in the people favored by the present authorities who unfortunately in their over-enthusiasm or passion or zeal confound the real accomplishments of ancient India with frankly ludicrously unprovable and fantastical claims, such as flying machines in the Vedic era and all of this stuff, which discredit the real truth. I mean, you know, when it is a historical, provable, verifiable fact that the earliest known example of surgery in human history is Sushruta and his peers in India. But when you have the Prime Minister of India saying that the fact that Ganesh has an elephant's head is proof of plastic surgery, you completely discredit the accomplishments of the real plastic surgeons. So the important thing is to be able to have discernment and judgment. So no, I would not support uncritically anything, because the revivalists also have to use their brains and their judgment. But things that are verifiable, historically documented, I would be very much there. And some of you may have read a couple of columns I wrote in The Hindu on this very theme about 15 years ago, in which I actually made this case for ancient Indian science to be rescued, so we ourselves should be aware. I mean, Aryabhatta anticipated Galileo and Newton and Copernicus centuries, and Kepler centuries before.
Almost 1,000 years earlier.
Yeah. And the fact is that you know, I never studied Aryabhatta till I read about him as an adult.
I mean, while Shashi and I may poke fun at each other on various political issues, but the fact of the matter is, I think the fact that historians disagree on interpretations of evidence is not surprising. I mean, we disagree on what happened yesterday. Just watch any TV debate. So the disagreement is not the problem. The problem is evidence. You see, we have to agree on what is reasonable primary evidence. And I think, unfortunately, this is partly simply laziness in that this evidence, and a lot of it, by the way, it's not static evidence. New stuff is coming out from genetics, it's coming out from archaeology. I think there is a need to document this as clearly as possible. And then reasonable interpretations, which can disagree, by the way, should be allowed. Okay,
Shashi.
one more, yes.
Shashi, most of us here have watched your debate at the Oxford Union on YouTube. Can we relive that experience? Can you take whatever minutes that you were given and reenact that? Because I think that will be a great experience.
Mr. Narayanmurthy, if somebody asked you to go back to your garage with your 10,000 rupees and write the first software program. Hello.
Hello.
Well, I couldn't do it without literally, I myself have not heard that speech since I delivered it. I know that all of you have heard it more recently than I have. And to be able now to sort of remember what I said, I remember a few of my lame jokes, but whether I could now marshal the you know, there's a moment. Some things happen in the moment. It's like, I think Sudhaji will confirm to you, anything you write is infinitely perfectible. It can always be improved by you or even by somebody else at some other point. But once you have decided to publish it, it's like giving birth. The baby is born, let the baby go out in the world and find his or her own place.
Sir, I want to ask one small question.
Yes, sir.
First thing, you look more smarter than any Bollywood star.
Oh. I suppose I should thank you for that, but I'm not sure.
Sir, you are one of the most beautiful men I ever seen.
Now, why couldn't a lady say that?
You're very right. No, a lot of ladies say that. So one small question I want to ask you. As you said about the immigrants, the Mughals, they have come here as immigrants, and after 3-4 generations, they have become like Indians only. But don't you think in India, more than 95% population of India is an immigrant? We have come from even Dravidians. That's what I read in the history.
Right.
And our country is also like immigrants like America. What do you think, sir, about this?
It's simply that we've been here longer. I mean, the Americans of today, particularly the white Americans who have just voted Mr. Trump to office, they are at most 400 years in that country. And in many cases, their family trees go much, much shorter. In some cases, barely a generation before they're assimilated. As the case of the First Lady, she moved to America as an adult, the wife of the president. So America is a country that's renewed itself through immigration, and so were we for the longest time, which is one of the reasons why, one of the peculiar things about caste, unlike, say, racial discrimination, is that there's been so much of miscegenation throughout the millennia that you can never tell a person's caste just by looking at them. Can you? I don't think so. And
I can't.
You can perhaps identify people.
You look like a Britisher.
No, sir, I resent that. In fact,
You have been caught.
no, sir. Let me tell you, I was born in Britain, but I have never, ever taken a British passport, even for convenience. And
Fantastic, fantastic.
I have been offered it many times by a succession of British consul generals. And my answer to them usually is, I'm sorry, I look in the mirror and I see an Indian.
Oh, great. So Mr. Vidyarthi want to speak to you, sir. He's a Bollywood star, big man.
No, I think you'll have to give it to some people at the back. You cannot pass it around here. I'm sorry. Can a gentleman at the back? Yeah, the gentleman, the red sweater. We'd like him to.
Yeah, why don't you come forward
Yeah,
a bit
come
to save
forward
time?
a little bit, yeah.
Let me take the opportunity.
Okay, then we'll give it to the gentleman. We'll take 2 questions in one shot then.
Yeah.
Okay. Yours and then the one gentleman at the back.
As recently as 1969, British people thought India will not remain united. Do they still have that mindset?
Not anymore, I think, especially after they started losing to us regularly at cricket. No, jokes apart. You're quite right that there was a lot of profound skepticism. In fact, Neville Maxwell, who was the London Times correspondent covering the 1967 elections, notoriously wrote that this will be the last elections in India. This country cannot hold together. And he was wrong. In fact, most political scientists and journalists in the late 50s, early 60s assumed that the breakup of India was a probability. Today, no one thinks that whatsoever. And in fact, there is, I think, genuinely no serious risk of that. We have developed a collective idea of India in the contemporary political sense. We always had a civilizational idea of India, but a contemporary political idea of India that is deeply entrenched, and that's no longer a prospect.
Yeah, we'll do literally the last question here. No further, if you have to allow others. The very last question. Let me add, while the mic is being passed on, that if Scottish independence happens, then we can take Churchill's comment on India and turn it on its head and say, Britain is no more a united nation any more than the equator.
Yeah.
Hello, Mr. Tharoor. Hello, Sanjeev. In an answer to Sanjeev's question, you said it's yes and no when he was asking you, what do you think about the revolutionaries and those people who are a little aggressive in their approach to independence? There is one particular gentleman who has been eulogized, who have been called controversial in some of the movies. We see Gandhi is not doing enough, and his name is Bhagat Singh. What do you think?
His name is?
Bhagat Singh.
Yeah, we talked about Bhagat Singh.
Yeah, so what do you think about him in particular? So can you...
No, I think he was a brilliant young man. If you've read his writings, They reveal an extraordinary intelligence and maturity that you cannot expect from a 21-year-old. Remarkable stuff, but very, very strongly influenced by Marx and communist doctrine, which I personally happen not to share, and therefore the extent of my admiration is tempered by the fact that I think he would have probably, as most people of that persuasion have tended to do, would have outgrown it with time and with broader reading and broader exposure. When you think how young he was extraordinarily bright. The other problem was that the revolutionary passion translated itself into a particular action that was essentially, he himself was intelligent enough to know it was futile. He was hoping that by throwing the bomb, he would ignite a general uprising, and that if he had to sacrifice his life in the process, that it would ignite a broader upsurge. That was very much a 21-year-old's view. I don't think any, I think if he had consulted some of the elders, even in those in communist politics in India, like M.N. Roy and so on, they would have told him, cool it, you can be a far greater use to the country if you stay alive and contribute your ideas and your energy and your passion and your zeal. But having said that, you cannot doubt his patriotism, you cannot doubt his intelligence, you cannot doubt his zeal, his conviction, his genuine commitment to the ideals of the nation, and therefore admiration is undoubtedly there. I have no doubt that he was an extraordinary man. But in India, what happens is we tend to hagio, we tend no longer to sort of just treat people as historical figures, we tend to almost deify them. So you can't say anything even mildly that humanizes Bhagat Singh without being accused of diminishing a giant godlike figure. So I'm going to pick my words carefully and say that the admiration is very much there, but I only wish that he had lived longer and contributed more.
Sure, thank you.
No.
We are really running out of time.
We can discuss off stage also.
Yeah, we can do that off stage. But yes, big round of applause. Big round of applause to our beautiful man, as someone called you, Dr. Shashi Tharoor and Sanjeev. Thank you so much for this incredible first session.